I need you to understand, before anything else, that it started as a joke. Not a mean joke. Not a suspicious wife joke. Just the kind of dumb, slightly wine-fueled idea that gets born on a Friday night when you and your best friend are sitting on the kitchen floor eating leftover pasta, and one of you, in this case me, says something like, "Wouldn't it be hilarious if I actually hired someone to follow Kevin around for a week?" And your best friend laughs and says, "Yes, that would be hilarious." And you both laugh for a while, and then you open another bottle of wine, and the idea floats there, harmless and funny, the way most ideas do at 11 o'clock on a Friday. Except I actually did it. That's the part that separates this story from the 100 other wine-fueled ideas that dissolved by morning. I actually did it. And the reason I tell you it started as a joke is not to excuse what came next, but to make sure you understand the altitude I was falling from. I was not a suspicious wife. I was not a worried wife. I was a bored, slightly silly wife who made an impulsive decision on a Friday night and paid $250 to a man named Frank, and then spent the next 11 days in a life I still recognized before opening an envelope that made it unrecognizable. Let me tell you about Kevin. Kevin and I met when we were both 24 at a work conference that neither of us wanted to attend. We were seated at the same table for a 3-hour workshop on something I have completely blocked from memory, and by the end of the first hour we had stopped taking notes and started drawing increasingly elaborate cartoon characters in the margins of our notebooks and passing them back and forth like we were in the 7th grade. By the end of the 3 hours, I knew 3 things. He was funny in a very specific, low-key way that I found immediately appealing. He hated overhead lighting, and I was going to give him my number before I left the building. We dated for 2 years. We got married at 26 in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard. 15 people, my grandmother's tablecloths, a playlist Kevin made himself that started with a Stevie Wonder song and ended with a deep cut from a band nobody at the wedding had heard of except us. It was perfect in the specific, imperfect way that only very personal things are perfect. We honeymooned in Portugal. We came home and bought a small house and got a cat named Gerald and started building the kind of life that looks, from the outside, like the kind of life people are supposed to want and from the inside feels, on most days, like something you actively chose and would choose again. Kevin was a project manager at a logistics company. He was organized in a way I found both admirable and slightly mystifying: color-coded calendars, quarterly personal reviews, a whiteboard in his home office where he tracked goals and progress the way other people track grocery lists. He was not a secretive person. He was, if anything, almost oppressively transparent.
He told me when he was stressed.
He told me when he was unhappy about something at work. He told me when he thought I was being unreasonable, which I sometimes was, and when I thought he was being unreasonable, which he sometimes was. We were, by the accounting of most people who knew us, one of those couples that made it look easy. I do not say this to brag. I say it because it is load-bearing information. It explains why what I did was a joke. It explains why the joke was not funny. The Friday night it happened, Kevin was at a work dinner. Legitimate, confirmed, multiple colleague event at a restaurant across town. He had told me about it 2 weeks earlier. He had texted me when he arrived and when he was leaving. He was home by 10:30, smelled like a steakhouse, talked for 20 minutes about a colleague who had ordered the wrong wine and been embarrassed about it. There was nothing wrong. There was nothing to be suspicious of. Priya, my best friend, was at my house because we had a standing Friday dinner and Kevin's work thing had overlapped with it and she had simply stayed later than usual. At some point, the conversation had turned to a true crime podcast Priya had been listening to. The episode was about a woman who had hired a PI to follow her husband after years of suspicion, and the PI had discovered something genuinely shocking. Priya said something like, "Could you imagine hiring someone to follow Kevin?" And I laughed and said, "The PI would just send me 14 hours of footage of him organizing spreadsheets." And we both laughed. And then I said, again, just as a joke, "I actually wonder how much that costs." I looked it up. This is where reasonable people close the browser. I did not close the browser. The first result was a local PI firm with a website that looked slightly more professional than I expected, a flat rate package for what they called a standard observation period. 5 business days, written report, time-stamped photographs, $250. The The price was so much lower than I expected that it reframed the whole thing in my brain from expensive and hypothetical to cheap enough to be funny. Priya, reading over my shoulder, said, "That's less than we spent on dinner." I filled out the contact form. I put Kevin's work address as the starting point, his car's description, his usual schedule. I paid with my personal card. I hit submit. Then I closed the laptop and poured more wine, and we talked about other things. And by the time Priya left at midnight, I had half convinced myself the whole thing would just evaporate, that they wouldn't follow through, or I would come to my senses and cancel, or that the report would come back as exactly what I expected. 14 hours of a very organized man doing very organized things, and I would laugh at myself and delete the email and never mention it to anyone. I did not cancel. The 5 business days passed. Kevin and I had a completely normal week. He made dinner on Tuesday. We argued mildly on Wednesday about whose turn it was to schedule the car's oil change and resolved it within 20 minutes. We watched a film on Thursday that he fell asleep halfway through, and I didn't wake him up because he looked comfortable. On Friday morning, he kissed me on the cheek on his way out the door the same way he had kissed me on the cheek on the way out the door approximately 1,200 times before, and I drank my coffee and did not think about the PI because I had largely stopped thinking about the PI, the way you stop thinking about a package you ordered when enough normal days have passed. The email arrived on a Friday afternoon. The subject line was simply, "Observation Report, client number 40471. There was a PDF attached. I stared at the email for a full minute before opening it. In that minute, I had a vivid, clear thought. I do not actually want to read this. Not because I was afraid of what it contained, but because I was suddenly, acutely aware of the absurdity of the situation I had put myself in. I had hired someone to surveil my husband, who had done nothing wrong, who told me when he was stressed, who had a color-coded calendar and a cat named Gerald, and had once driven 40 minutes in the rain to bring me ibuprofen when I had a headache and didn't want to leave the house. What exactly was I expecting to find? I opened the PDF. The first pages were what I expected. Time-stamped photographs. Kevin leaving the office building at 5:43 on Monday. Kevin at the dry cleaner on Tuesday, picking up what the report described as 2 dress shirts and 1 coat. Kevin at the gym on Wednesday morning, arriving at 6:15 and leaving at 7:40. Kevin meeting a colleague for lunch on Thursday at a sandwich place near the office, the report noting. Conversation appeared work-related, no physical contact. Subjects departed separately. Everything normal. Everything completely, boringly, exactly what I knew Kevin's week looked like. And then I got to Thursday evening. The report noted that on Thursday at 6:48 p.m., the subject deviated from his standard route home. He drove instead to a residential neighborhood approximately 12 minutes from the office, a part of the city I recognized, though I couldn't immediately place why, and parked in front of a small house on a street called Birchwood Lane. He was carrying something. The photograph was slightly grainy in the way photographs taken from a distance at dusk are slightly grainy, but I could make out a bag, a canvas tote looked like, and what appeared to be a paper bag from a grocery store. He went inside. The report noted he was inside for 1 hour and 53 minutes. When he came back out, the tote bag and the grocery bag were gone. He drove home. The report included a photograph of the house on Birchwood Lane, a small white craftsman bungalow with a porch light on and a window with the curtains open and warm light coming from inside. I read this section 3 times. Then I looked at the photograph of the house again. And then I remembered why I recognized the neighborhood. The house on Birchwood Lane belonged to Kevin's brother. His brother, whose name was Scott, was 38 years old and had been, for the past 14 months, in the middle of what could charitably be called a very difficult period. He had lost his job in the spring of last year. His long-term girlfriend had ended their relationship 2 months after that, which Kevin and I had both suspected was related to the job loss but had never said out loud. He had started drinking more than was good for him. Not dramatically, not crisis level, but enough that Kevin had mentioned it to me once, quietly, with the specific careful tone he used when he was worried about something but didn't want to amplify it by talking about it too much. Scott lived alone in that small white house on Birchwood Lane. He did not ask for help. He was, Kevin had said more than once, very stubborn about that particular thing. Kevin had been going to see him every Thursday evening, apparently. Arriving with groceries and whatever was in the tote bag, I would later find out it was things like good coffee and books Scott had mentioned wanting to read, and once a new houseplant because Scott had told Kevin that his old one had died, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. He had been doing this for, as I found out when I finally asked about it, 11 months. Every Thursday. Without telling me. Without mentioning it. Going quietly to his brother's house on a residential street in the dark and staying for almost 2 hours, and then coming home and talking about his colleague, who ordered the wrong wine. I put the report down on the kitchen table. Gerald the cat jumped up and sniffed it and walked away, which felt appropriate. I sat there in my kitchen for a long time.
Now.
Here is where the story gets complicated. And I want to be careful here because the complicated part is not what you might expect. I was not angry. That surprises people when I tell them. The expectation, I think, is that the discovery of a secret, any secret, regardless of its nature, should produce anger in a marriage. The reasoning goes, if he was hiding something good, why was he hiding it? What does it mean that your husband has a whole portion of his week that you didn't know about? Doesn't it matter that he was keeping something from you, even if that something turns out to be groceries for a struggling brother? I have thought about these questions for a long time. I have thought about them more carefully probably than most people think about the things they discover in their marriages, because the particular absurdity of my situation, the joke, the PI, the $250, the report, required me to hold two contradictory truths at the same time. The first truth was that my husband was keeping a secret from me. The second truth was that the secret was an act of consistent, private, unannounced love for someone who is too proud to accept help openly. And the thing about those two truths is that the second one does not cancel out the first, but it changes the weight of the first in a way that is very difficult to explain without sounding like you are making excuses. I called Priya. It was a Saturday morning by this point. I had sat with the report all of Friday night, not sleeping much, not eating much, just sitting with the information and turning it over. Priya answered on the second ring, and I told her everything. There was a long silence on her end, and then she said, "So you hired a PI to catch your husband bringing groceries to his brother." The way she said it was not unkind. It was just accurate. "Yes," I said. "That is what happened." Another silence. Then Priya said, "What are you going to do?" And I realized I had no idea. The question of what to do felt, at first, simple. Tell Kevin. Tell him about the report, about the joke that wasn't a joke, about the Friday night and the $250 and the PDF on the kitchen table. Confess the whole thing because that was clearly what you did when you had done something you were not entirely proud of. You told the person it concerned. You were honest. That was the rule. Except here was the problem. If I told Kevin about the report, I would also have to explain what was in the report. And explaining what was in the report meant revealing that I knew about Thursdays. And knowing about Thursdays, this was the part that kept snagging on something in me, might change Thursdays. Kevin had been doing something beautiful and private for 11 months. He had found a way to help someone who didn't want to be helped by simply showing up, regularly, quietly, without making it a thing. The moment I told him I knew, it became a thing. It entered the official record of our marriage. It went from being Kevin's private act of love for his brother to being a story we both knew, a story that would inevitably get told at dinners, a story Scott might one day find out about and feel differently about because of. I did not want to be the person who took that from him, but I also did not want to lie. I sat with this for 4 days. Kevin and I had our normal week. He left for the office on Monday, came home, made dinner. On Tuesday, he asked me if I wanted to take a weekend trip somewhere in the next month, and I said yes, and we looked at a few options online. On Wednesday, I came home to find he had already scheduled the car's oil change, which meant he had seen my name on the whiteboard where we tracked things like that, and had just done it without making a point of it, which was so completely him that I had to go into the bathroom for a few minutes and get myself together. Thursday came. 6:48 p.m. I was in the kitchen when I heard his car start in the driveway. I stood at the window and watched the headlights back out, and I thought, Birchwood Lane, canvas tote, houseplant, 2 hours in the light of his brother's living room. And I thought about Scott, who I had always liked but never known how to reach, who had gotten quieter in the past year in the way people get quieter when they are embarrassed by their own lives and don't want anyone to notice. And I thought about Kevin, who had noticed, who had simply decided to show up. I made dinner for one that night. I set one place at the table, which I almost never did, and I ate and I thought. And by the time Kevin's headlights came back up the driveway at 9:30, I had made a decision. I did not tell Kevin about the PI. Not that night. What I did instead, and I want to describe this carefully because the sequence matters, is that I started paying attention. Not suspicious attention. Grateful attention. The kind of attention you pay to a person when you have been given information about them that makes you love them differently than you did before. I started noticing the things I had probably been taking for granted. The way he always refilled my water glass without being asked. The way he talked to Gerald in a completely different voice than he used for anything else. A softer one, slightly ridiculous, that he would have died of embarrassment if anyone outside the apartment had heard. The way he still, after 8 years, turned toward me in his sleep. I also started paying attention to Scott. I called him, which I had not done in a while, not since Christmas. I was ashamed to realize. I suggested that the three of us have dinner sometime. Kevin, when I mentioned this, looked at me in a way I couldn't quite read and said that sounded really good, that Scott had been a little isolated lately. I know, I said. I thought it might be nice. Kevin looked at me for another second and then agreed and pulled out his phone to text Scott, and I watched him do it and thought about Birchwood Lane. We had the dinner 6 weeks later. Scott was thinner than the last time I'd seen him and quieter, but he was there, and he laughed twice at Kevin's dry, understated jokes, and at one point he told a story about a neighbor's dog that made all three of us laugh in a way that filled up the restaurant a little. When we walked out into the parking lot and said goodbye, Scott hugged Kevin for slightly longer than usual. Kevin patted him on the back. Neither of them said anything about it. In the car on the way home, Kevin was quiet for a few minutes. Then he said, "Thanks for suggesting that." I said it was nothing. He said, "It wasn't nothing." And then he looked out the passenger window in the way he does when he is feeling something he doesn't quite have words for, and I drove us home. 3 months after I received the report, I told him. We were doing dishes on a Sunday evening, one of those perfectly ordinary domestic moments that turns out to be exactly the right setting for the things that are actually important, and I just said, "I have to tell you something I did, and it's embarrassing, and I need you to hear the whole thing before you respond." He turned off the tap and turned to look at me. I told him everything. The Friday night, the wine, the contact form, the $250, the PDF on the kitchen table. I told him what was in the report. I told him I knew about Thursdays. I told him I had decided to sit on it for 3 months, not because I wanted to deceive him, but because I had needed to figure out what to do with something I had no business knowing in the first place. I told him I was sorry I had done it, and I was not sorry for what I had found. Kevin was quiet for a long time. He dried his hands on the dish towel. He was quiet for long enough that I started to feel the specific anxiety of not knowing whether someone is thinking or gathering themselves to be angry. Then he said, "Scott would absolutely lose his mind if he knew there were surveillance photographs of him letting me in his house." I stared at him.
He stared at me.
And then we both laughed, the helpless kind, the kind that comes from somewhere real and releases something that has been coiled up tighter than you realized. And we laughed in our kitchen on a Sunday night until my eyes were watering, and Gerald came to investigate the noise, and Kevin was leaning against the counter holding the dish towel over his face. When we were done, Kevin said, "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to make it a thing for Scott. He doesn't want to feel like a project." I said I knew. He said, "You should have just asked me where I was going on Thursdays." I said, "I know, you're right." He said, $250. I said, "The website said it was less than dinner." He laughed again, shorter this time. Then he said, "Frank sent pretty good photographs, actually." And I said, "He really did." We told Scott. Not right away. We waited another 2 months, until Scott was in a visibly more stable place, until there was enough distance from the difficult period that it could be told as a story rather than lived as a wound. Kevin told him first privately, and then Scott called me and said, "So you accidentally did surveillance on my groceries?" And I said, "That is a very accurate description of what happened." And Scott laughed, real laughter, the first time I'd heard it in over a year, and said, "Please tell me there are actual photographs." I said there were. He said, "I need to see them." I sent them. He called back 15 minutes later and left a voicemail that was 40 seconds of barely controlled laughing and then him saying, in a completely steady voice, "This is the funniest thing that has ever happened to anyone." And then more laughing. Scott is doing better now. Not fixed. I don't think people in difficult periods get fixed exactly. I think they get gradually more themselves again, piece by piece, in a process that is invisible until suddenly it isn't. He found a new job 4 months ago. He got a dog, which Kevin and I found out about when Scott sent us a photo of a medium-sized brown creature with enormous ears and the caption, "Her name is Tuesday." He still has the houseplant Kevin brought him. He told me it's the first plant he hasn't killed in 6 years, which he seems genuinely proud of. Kevin still goes to Birchwood Lane sometimes. Not every Thursday now. Scott's schedule is fuller, and the standing appointment has relaxed into something more casual, a check-in rather than a life raft. But he goes. Sometimes he brings groceries. Sometimes he doesn't bring anything and they just watch the game or talk or sit in the kind of silence that only works between people who have known each other long enough that the silence has furniture in it. I have thought a lot about what I actually found when I opened that report. I thought I was going to find out something bad or something mundane, or at best nothing at all. 14 hours of a very organized man doing organized things. What I actually found was a person I had been married to for 8 years doing something quietly extraordinary that I had not known to look for. I found out that my husband had an entirely private capacity for love that expressed itself not in grand gestures, but in showing up. Every Thursday, with groceries, without fanfare. I have asked myself since whether I would have found that out without the report. Maybe. Probably, eventually, these things tend to surface. But the particular way I found out the absurdity of it, the wine and the Friday night and the $250 and Frank's slightly grainy dusk photographs, meant that I understood it completely before Kevin ever explained it. I got to see it without the explanation. I got to see him as he actually was, in a moment he had not staged or narrated or framed for my benefit. Just Kevin, in the dark, carrying a canvas towed up a porch step. That version of him, unstaged, unseen, doing the right thing with no audience, is the one I keep. I hired a private investigator on my husband as a joke. The report came back. I have not laughed since. Not in the way I expected to laugh. I have laughed differently. Better. In our kitchen on a Sunday evening, leaning against the counter, the way you laugh when something costs you something and gives you back more than you paid. Gerald is still alive, by the way. He is 11 now and extremely opinionated about the schedule of his meals and completely indifferent to everything else, which is maybe the most correct way to move through the world. The houseplant is also still alive. Make of that what you will.